ask us to remove his
Okay,
signature.
and my understanding is SIG is online.
I think the people who signed that, the 8,000 who signed that letter were
Okay.
very brave.
Well, thank
the-
you. I'm gonna,
the
is
anti-war.
everyone ready?
Of course. Oh, and I think
Councillor?
they all will
Sorry?
be.
Are you three all ready? Because I think we're at
yeah, let me
8:30,
put-
so I'm thinking it's time to get started.
Look, official.
And then I will also sit here.
So, I also spoke to Sunayev, Rashid Sunayev, Rashid Sunayev.
Oh,
Yeah, we were talking to him as well.
I think I know his son.
You're my
He's in Garching.
person.
He's old enough that his son would probably be right.
Right. And he's a famous scientist.
Yeah,
and he's been,
astrophysicist, yeah.
no, not Rashid, but Shamin, I think.
Uh-huh.
So good morning, and welcome to everyone. As president of the American Physical Society, I would like to welcome everyone to this session concerning the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Thank you for joining us today, and I would like to start the session with a moment of silence for everyone in Ukraine whose lives have been torn apart by this invasion. Thank you. Many APS members, as well as the broader physics community, have reached out to the APS regarding the tragic situation in the Ukraine and what the society is doing and can do in response to that. We want to utilize the opportunity of this April meeting to accomplish a couple of things. First, we will explore the post-Soviet history and background of the Russian-Ukrainian relations. And secondly, we would like to brief everyone on APS actions in support of Ukraine. And thirdly, we would like to hear from our audience. I'll say a little more about what the structure of this session will look like in a moment. We are privileged today to have several distinguished speakers with us. So first, on my left, first on my immediate left is Amy Flatten, who's an APS staff person who's helped greatly in all of the things you're going to hear about today, as well as in putting this session together. So to her left is Dr. George Gamota of the Science and Technology Management Association, who will speak about the post-Soviet history of physics collaborations and challenges in the context of the Ukraine, Russia, and the US. Then to his immediate left is Dr. Konstantin Sonin of the University of Chicago, who will address the always interesting topic of separating fact from fiction. Third, online, will be Dr. Sig Hecker of Stanford University, who will talk about the nuclear dimensions of Putin's war in Ukraine. And finally, on my far left, is APS Chief Executive Officer Jonathan Bagger, who will brief us about the APS's response to the invasion. So the format of this session will be 25-minute presentations, and we will hold questions and answers, Q&A, and audience comments and whatever comments the audience wishes to share till the end of all four of the speakers. So that's because I expect that some of the Q&A could become complex or could become extended, and so I would like to get all 4 speakers done first, and then we'll do Q&A and comments and so forth. When we get to the Q&A and comment part, I'm going to ask audience members to limit your comments to not more than 1 minute. We have a total of 30 minutes, but I would like to ask audience to please to limit your comments to 1 minute, and I ask you to not speak a second time until everybody in the room has had a chance to speak. Does that make sense? I will remind you all of that when we get there. So with that, let's get started. So I am pleased now to introduce our first speaker, Dr. George Gamoda of the Science and Technology Management Associates. George Gamoda is the founder and president of the Science and Technology Management Associates in Lexington, Massachusetts. He holds a PhD in physics from the University of Michigan and is a fellow of the American Association of the Advancement of Science, as well as APS. He is an honorary fellow of the Ukrainian Physical Society, a foreign member of the Ukrainian National Academy of Sciences, and a senior member of the IEEE. Dr. Gamoda worked in the former Soviet Union beginning in 1991, and he has 13 years of experience working in Central and Eastern Europe. 6 years were spent designing and managing technology business incubators and competitive grant programs in the Ukraine. 2 such programs include the Kharkiv Initiative and the Business Incubator Development Program in Slavutik. Oh gosh, I'm not going to know how to say this. Slavutik. Am I close? Slavutik? Slavutik. A new city which was created by workers from the disabled Chernobyl nuclear reactor. So, Dr. Gamoda?
Thank you, Frances. Good morning, everybody. It is my pleasure to be here today, but I wish it was a little bit more pleasant situation. My outlook on the Ukrainian-Russian science collaboration is going to be viewed from the perspective of the Ukrainian side, or maybe even Ukrainian-American side. The brutality of the war in Ukraine, especially the crimes committed against ordinary citizens throughout the war zones, makes it difficult to speak about collaborative scientific efforts between Ukrainians and Russians. Ukrainian scientists who remain in Ukraine are making Molotov cocktails and are not worried about the research that they would like to pursue unless it can help the war effort, very much like American scientists during World War II. Those who left Ukraine are spending time figuring out how to help their colleagues back home or to provide for their families. Some have gone back even to help save the country. To put things in perspective, there are about 95,000 scientists in Ukraine before February 24th, 2022, the start of the war by Russia. Today, 78,000 are still in the country. 17,000 are refugees. These are mostly women with children. The APS has a rich history of helping Ukrainian scientists. They were the first to start up and create an emergency program in the early 1990s to help former Soviet scientists find a way to continue their work as all funding ceased due to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Then there was no war, no killings, but the disappearance of a financial and political system created chaos and fear. Fear that some former Soviet scientists might join rogue countries in developing weapons, sell the know-how to develop weapons of mass destruction. Today's situation is different, but maybe more critical. Men and women are getting butchered as they stay in their homes and women and children are getting raped and then shot and left on the streets. 10 million people are displaced. 10 million, a quarter of the population of Ukraine. And 4.5 million women and children and the elderly have fled to only carrying what they can on their backs. The men and women who stay behind are fighting for freedom and want to push back the aggressor who wants to destroy their very identity, culture, history. Putin does not even acknowledge that there is such a country as, or people like Ukraine, or that he is pursuing a war of aggression against a neighbor that he calls family. As a graduate student at the University of Michigan, I knew about Landau, Bohulubets, Sikorsky, and other Ukrainian scientists, but most were hidden under the umbrella of being Russian. I had to argue with my civics teacher in high school that I was Ukrainian and not Russian or Polish. They had choice, Polish or Russian. There was no such thing as a Ukrainian. During the 50-year era of American and Soviet scientific contacts, there were no Ukrainians. The focus was on Moscow and St. Petersburg institutions. Sorry, it went to... Even those Ukrainians who were Ukrainian but moved to Moscow because they got better jobs there, they sort of became Russian under the umbrella. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the focus again was on Russia. Ukraine was far behind, and other former Soviet states were largely disregarded, except for one issue. Ukraine had the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. The State Department was distressed about having to set up 14 new embassies. At first, they considered having a single large FSU, former Soviet Union, center to be Russian-oriented. The center of attention was again on Russia. Once Ukraine agreed to eliminate its nuclear arsenal, U.S. lavished its diplomatic attention on Russia. In return for turning over its nuclear arsenal, Ukraine had the so-called Budapest Agreement guaranteeing Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. This was co-signed by Russia, Ukraine, and U.S. Here we have the signature between President Clinton, Yeltsin, and Kravchuk. Kravchuk was the first elected president of Ukraine. And the agreement was to send this is an SS-19 intercontinental missile, to Russia, and Ukraine agreed to be nuclear free. And I might say it's the only country so far that has had nuclear weapons and has decided to denuclearize. To help former Soviet scientists cope with the sudden lack of funding, the International Science Center was created in Moscow. Initially, it was to serve all FSU countries. With outrage from the Ukrainian diaspora in the United States, Congress reluctantly approved a second center in Kyiv, especially when Canada stepped up and provided significant funding and offered to manage it. We couldn't find any managers in the US, so we gave it to Canada. The center, SDCU, still stands today in Kyiv, and it basically serves Ukraine as well as Georgia and a couple of other smaller Caucasus states. The Moscow Center was moved to Almaty, Kazakhstan, at the request of Mr. Putin, who back in 2010, he said, Russians have enough money, we don't need American money. So they moved the center away. All collaborations with Russian scientists ceased at that time. It only serves Kazakhstan and other Eurasian countries at this point. My first encounter with a Ukrainian scientist was in 1968 at a low-temperature conference in St. Andrews, Scotland. This was an international conference which included a group from the Soviet Union. The group kept to themselves, and they, of course, had a guy who kind of served as a honcho and spoke English. And so I asked them if there were any Ukrainians in the group. He said, "Oh, yes," and introduced me to one of the people in the group. I was happy, and I started to speak to him in Ukrainian. It became immediately obvious that he was not Ukrainian and did not understand Ukrainian, and so he answered back in English. That was that. And then we had a dinner at a local restaurant with limited tables, and the maitre d' separated guests during the evening session. And against protocol, she separated the Soviet scientists. Thus, my wife and I sat next to one of these scientists. We exchanged greetings, and I asked where he was from. Surprisingly, he said, "Kharkiv." Not hesitantly, I started to speak to him in Ukrainian. And I'm not exaggerating, but his face lit up like a lamp. At first, he was speechless, but then answered in perfect Ukrainian. "Where are you from? How did you learn Ukrainian?" The three of us, including my wife, talked to Ihor Dmitrenko, that is shown here, that evening. Dmitrenko worked at the Institute of Low Temperature Physics in Kharkiv, and his specialty was superconductivity, which was right to my background, so we really had a lot of things in common. I was at Bell Labs at the time, and we exchanged contact information and promised to stay in touch, agreeing to meet again at the next low temperature conference in Kyoto, Japan. Sadly, I did not see him again or hear from him until 1993, when Ukraine was independent. I visited Kharkiv and the Institute of Low Temperature Physics and learned the sad story of what happened to him after our meeting. And I don't need to describe what happened, but you know what people did that. When the Soviet Union collapsed and Ukraine declared independence, I was delighted with disbelief. Like most in the Ukrainian diaspora, I wanted to help bring Ukraine out of the Soviet past, out of the Russian orbit and into the rightful Western world. After all, it is part of Europe. I became acquainted with the staff at the Ukrainian embassy in Washington and met with the new science attaché, fellow physicist Victor Loss. We quickly established a rapport, and Victor set up a meeting for me to meet with the new science advisor to Ukraine's President Kravchuk, Ihor Yukhnovsky. Yukhnovsky is a theoretical physicist from Lviv, my birth city, so it was incredibly heartfelt for me to not only meet a fellow Ukrainian physicist, but someone from my hometown. After we exchanged stories about the backgrounds, Yukhnovsky asked me if I could visit Ukraine and help him evaluate the existing science centers. He admitted that many of the technology centers in Ukraine reported directly to Moscow, so the new Ukrainian government did not really have a full grasp on what they had on their land. Soon after the meeting, I received the official invitation and visited Ukraine. I quickly accepted the invitation and spent 6 weeks in Ukraine. It was my first visit as an adult, having left as a 5-year-old when the Soviet army moved into Western Ukraine. What I found in May 1992 was a country that was jubilant about being free and independent. I did not know what to expect, but I can tell you that I was exuberant. I was met with 2 Ukrainian scientists that Yukhnovsky sent me. They welcomed me in English, but they quickly followed suit when I replied in Ukrainian. They were Alexander Sobodanyuk and Volodymyr Andreev. After spending 2 days in Kyiv, I went to Kharkiv, Dnipro, Mykolaiv, Sevastopol, Odessa, Lviv, and finally back to Kyiv. I wrote a 6-volume report of my visits and submitted it to Yukhnovsky upon my return. I also left a copy and for American scientists and companies that were quite interested to see what was available in Ukraine. I traveled mostly by train. It actually was my first time that I really traveled a lot on the train, and it was quite good. From Kyiv, you had overnight train rides to most places in Ukraine, so that kind of gave you a chance not to spend time in hotels. But the Nuke accompanied me during most of my journey. In Dnipro, I met the director of Yushmash, the center where SS-19 and 24 intercontinental missiles were built. I was hosted by its director, Leonid Kuchma, who later became second president of Ukraine. Kuchma showed me around the facility, and I was given a chance to see how missile shells were made. It was a technique developed by Boris Paton, how to electro-weld titanium, something that actually U.S. did not really know how to do very well. And the technology was also used in submarines. According to the folks I met, I was the first American to visit some cities, aside from Kyiv and Lviv. In fact, while in Sevastopol, one of my hosts said, "If you were here a year ago, you probably would have been arrested and shot as a spy." I guess because of my background in the Defense Department, word got out very quickly that here was an American, someone who was director for research in the Department of Defense. According to the folks I met, I was the first American to visit some cities. And many initially didn't know how to speak with me. They tried to speak in English. Of course, I responded in Ukrainian, and some of them had trouble speaking Ukrainian. It was interesting. I quickly was able to ascertain the allegiance of the directors of the various science centers by noticing whose picture was hanging in their offices. If it was Taras Shevchenko, a Ukrainian national bard, I kind of knew that they were patriotic Ukrainians. Whereas if the picture was of Lenin, then, well, you can guess what that meant. And there were a few with Lenin hanging on the walls. I had trouble getting into some of the facilities. In fact, the one in the Arsenal in Kyiv. And it took a president of the National Academy of Sciences, Boris Paton, to personally come and escort me to the facility. Back in the States, it was clear that the US government was unprepared for the breakup of the Soviet Union. The State Department had no idea how to deal with 15 new countries. We have no space for 15 new country offices, I was told. 15 ambassadors. Where are we going to get them? The first reaction was to rename the office New Eurasia Office. To a large degree, American scientific organizations were slow to react, except for the American Physical Society. I approached AAAS, American Chemical Society, and IEEE with little success. APS was the leader in organizing the emergency program that we had. None of the others provided any support. The APS effort was initiated by Bill Plenary, who was chair of POPA at that time. I, as a former POPA member, was responsible for programs in Ukraine. Irving Lurch was the director of International Office, Amy's former director. APS used their own funds. Now, mind you, they used their own funds, plus they had small grants from members. They had a fundraising from members, and a substantial sum from the Soros Foundation. The APS program in Ukraine, which I managed, had 3 parts. First was a small grant program for young scientists, those under 35. Second was support of the recently established Ukrainian Physical Society. About 2 years prior to independence, they created the Ukrainian Physical Society along Western standards, and so I was delighted to see them functioning. And third, I started organizing summer conferences akin to Gordon conferences in Ukraine. And these would be, we would invite American scientists to participate, and we had 3 of them in different cities over a 3-year span. The small grant program was competitively arranged with successful applicants receiving a $500 cash award. And here we have one of the recipients getting the award. A year later, APS CEO Julie France and Irving Lurch came to Kyiv to formalize the relationship between the APS and the Ukrainian Physical Society. And here we have Judy actually giving a gift to Sobodanyuk, which was a laptop, and Irving on the left side. We also did an informal audit of how the money was spent from the grants. And here we have one of the 2 of the recipients who pulled their money together and actually did some substantial physics problems in 1 year, rather than spending the money on, livelihood. The summer conferences started in 1993 and ran for 3 years. They were held in Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Lviv. Here we have one of the Americans coming to the conference in Lviv, unpacking their baggage. Significant funding next came from George Soros. He had the Soros Foundation, and you might remember that he set up an international science foundation and provided $100 million to FSU countries. A good chunk of that went to Russia. Next was Ukraine and the other countries in line. And it was managed by Gerson Scher, a good friend and a former NSF manager. Fast forward, we come to the 2014 Maidan Revolution and Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and Russia-inspired Donbas uprising in Donetsk and Luhansk. You can see here, this is the main thoroughfare in Kyiv, and was basically tent city. Thousands of people protested against the corrupt president. At that time, U.S. administration really did not feel like there was much threat from Putin. Yes, there were some things said about Russia trying to fuel its oaths, but to a large degree, Putin did not get punished for annexing Crimea or setting up a Donbas separatist states. I think this was probably a major mistake, because had Putin realized that the West was against him in chopping up parts of neighboring countries, something would have been done. But nothing was done other than a few punishments, sanctions. Thus, what began a peaceful protest against the corrupt pro-Russian president, Yanukovych, it turned ugly and violent when the president sent his special forces to kidnap, torture, and kill over 100 innocent bystanders. Included in these casualties was one of our own, Yuri Verbitsky, a noted geologist. His tortured and burned body was burned near the airport in Kyiv. And here's the protest with carrying Verbitsky's photo. Russia's illegal aggression in 2014 resulted in a million people internally displaced as Ukrainians fled from those occupied areas in Donbas and Crimea. As in 1992, American Physical Society was again asked to help by a sister organization and colleagues in Ukraine. On January 12, 2015, the Ukrainian Physical Society president, Maxim Strycha, sent an appeal to the European Physical Society, American Physical Society, and others to help the displaced physicists from the Donbas and Crimea, currently being relocated to various parts of Ukraine. Several universities, including Donetsk State University, one of the major universities in the East, was moved physically by some 300 miles to Vinnytsia. Faculty, their families, and over 1,000 students were temporarily living in Vinnytsia. Most have graduated, and the university continues to this day. That was 8 years ago. Today, the whole country is being attacked. Its very existence is being questioned by an aggressor who does not even call it a war, but a special military operation to get rid of Nazis. What can the American Physical Society do? What should it do and when? During the war and after the war, because there will be an after the war. I think this is something that we really need to think about as an organization. A few words of collaboration between Ukrainians and Russian scientists. Before the collapse, of course, there was a single organization supporting scientists. It was the USSR State Committee. It funded about 90% of its projects in Russia and only about 6% in Ukraine. Russian scientist organizations were also better supplied with modern equipment, as was shown in the 90s when things were accessible. Joint scientific conferences were held following similar research profiles, much like in the US. After the collapse, all funding ceased, so collaborations stopped except for personal relationships. Those continued. The president of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, academician Boris Paton, was a supporter of a collaboration between the Ukrainian Academy and the newly restructured Russian Academy of Sciences. But none of the Western funding organizations encouraged that collaboration. Collaborations were encouraged between Ukrainian and Western science centers, similarly between Russian and Western organizations. The partnership between Russian and Ukrainian scientists to a large degree stopped after 2014. They still met at various international conferences, but that was basically it. Last year, that was ratcheted up when a number of Ukrainian Academy members started a protest by boycotting a mathematics conference held in St. Petersburg, Russia. Some attended, but most did not. Today, there's talk about how we should treat Russian scientists who are supporting the war. Organizations are worried about losing contact, punishing those that remain silent. My suggestion is that we should look at how did American or allies treated German or Nazi scientists during the Nazi era. How did we treat Heisenberg during World War II? He was a friend. Did we have collaborations? As to Ukrainians, the recently issued declaration of the Ukrainian National Academy of Sciences pretty much summarizes their stand. It was published just a week ago, and I will read the English version of it. Declaration of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. In recent days, Ukraine and the entire civilized world have literally been shaken by the terrible consequences of the Russian invasion of the Kyiv Oblast. Once cozy streets of small towns and villages around the Ukrainian capital are now completely destroyed and strewn with bodies of murdered civilian residents. Dozens of innocent, peaceful people killed by Russian occupants are lying in the streets and near their homes. The whole families were murdered while trying to leave the towns in their cars, with the occupants giving them no chance to escape. Instead of flower beds, there are graves in the yards of residential complexes. Mass graves with hundreds of mutilated bodies, tortured sufferers, humiliated martyrs. Blood freezes when these atrocities are described. People are permeated with horror and numbers after imagining the human suffering endured, unbearable pain caused by the trials of people before their deaths. There are no words which could describe those who committed that. Hangmen, murderers, non-humans, beastly creatures who pretend to be human beings. It seemed that the horrors of the Nazi torments were back in the past. It seemed that the inferno of the Nazi camps and the shooting of peaceful citizens remained forever in history books, are now again being held. It is difficult to realize that the footage is showing the world of the 21st century, which has been repeatedly chanting, "Never again," and learning lessons of the war. However, all these atrocities are happening again. In the center of Europe, in the modern state, peaceful Ukrainians are deliberately executed by Russian occupants. Undoubtedly, the war in Ukraine, atrocities and horrible murders of civilians are an actual genocide of Russians against Ukrainian people. There is no and can be no excuses for these beastly creatures disguised as humans. We realize with deep terror that the Russian society are not only victims and hostages of the Kremlin disinformation and manipulative news, but in full are accomplices of this mass massacre of the innocents. The Russian intellectual elite, who should be the highest embodiment of the principle of humanism, protection of the human race, of its dignity and honor, rights and freedoms, are silently watching this massacre of civilians. Instead of demonstrating civil courage, conscience, and dignity, which are inherent in the scientific community, they openly approve mass executions of peaceful people and the spread of misanthropic ideas. We do believe all the guilty will be punished, but the bad who murdered and the good who are silent. Generations of Russians will be held accountable and will atone for the sins of atrocities committed by their husbands, brothers, and sons in Ukraine, the dead and the living and the unborn. We call for the international scientific community, the whole world, to give an honest appraisal to the genocide of Russian occupants against the peaceful people of Ukraine. Eternal, bright memory for all martyrs and liberators. That was the declaration made by the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that powerful, reading that powerful declaration, as well as the personal recollections. So I'm very pleased to next introduce our second speaker, Dr. Konstantin Sonin of the University of Chicago. Dr. Sonin is the John Dewey Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. His research interests include political economics, development, and economic theory. His papers have been published in leading academic journals in economics and political science. He earned a master's and a PhD in mathematics from Moscow State University and a master's in economics from Moscow's New Economic School. He was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, served on the faculty of Moscow's New Economic School and the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, and was also a member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He currently is affiliated with both the Higher School of Economics in Moscow along with the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics as a visiting professor and advisor. In addition to his academic work, Dr. Sonin writes a blog on Russian political and economic issues. Dr. Sonin?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'll talk about Russia-Ukraine war, separating fact from fiction. So I'll get to the fiction part, but I will start with some basic facts, and I apologize if I say something trivial, because I wanted to start with the very beginning. So first, Ukraine and Russia today. If you look at the globe, then Russia is, of course, a huge country. And if you look at the map, Russia even a larger country than it is on the globe. But I wanted to stress that Ukraine is also actually a very large country. It's one of the largest European countries. There is a big difference in that Russia is a rich country and Ukraine is a relatively poor country. Russia's capital, Moscow, is the largest city in Europe, but the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, is actually the 7th largest city in Europe, so it's also a huge city. Finally, like in this brief part of the basic facts, about 30% of Ukrainians have Russian as their native language. And if you hear like competing narratives about this, then this typically a large part of claims that Russians, for example, make about Ukrainians being the same as Russians. I need to say that around the world, it's quite typical that very different countries, not necessarily former colonies, share the same language. So actually, even if most of Ukrainians would be speaking Russians, this wouldn't make them Russians in any way. So the brief history of Ukraine and Russia is sort of typical for neighboring European countries. So back 1,000 years ago, when Moscow was basically a swamp in the forest, nobody lived there. At the time, Kyiv was a large European city, and daughters of Kievan princes become queens of France at some point. Then, 500 years fast forward, Kyiv, a large city within or close to, in different times, to Greater Lithuania and Poland, and Moscow became the largest city of the emerging Russian Tsardom. In about 1700, Kyiv became a large city within Russian Empire, so the Russian Empire absorbed what is currently the eastern part of Ukraine, and Moscow was already the largest city of the empire and the capital of the empire. Fast forward 300 years, now Moscow is the capital of Russia, Kyiv is the capital of Ukraine. So the basic point here, this, I think, point is, which is very standard for Europeans, might be unusual for Americans, is that most countries in Europe that neighbor each other, they actually have sort of historical territorial contests. They have overreaching claims to each other's history. They have their own, historical narratives. There is nothing unusual about that. These are just two different countries. Each of them has a history. They have a common history, and each of them could pursue a narrative that they're actually the origin and the claimant on the other side territory. For example, obviously the Roman Empire was half of the Europe. Greater Lithuania was half of the Europe. The Napoleonic France was half of the Europe at the time. Basically, the point here that Ukraine was at some point a part of the Russian Empire does not mean that it is not an independent country today. Okay, so for the last 30 years, Ukraine became an independent country in 1991. It was not for the first time in history. It was independent from Russia many times. Since 1991, Ukraine is a competitive democracy. There are different definitions. Political scientists have a lot of definitions of what democracy is, but one of the simplest possible ways to look at a democratic country is the country in which incumbents lose elections. Actually, Ukraine is one of the very few countries in the world in which incumbents typically lose elections. Only one president of 6 presidents won the re-election. In other cases, the opposition won. They have been having competitive parliamentary elections for 30 years. They have had largely free media, of course, during the war. The free media, there are some significant restrictions on this. Finally, Vladimir Zelensky, the current president of Ukraine, defeated the incumbent in the second round of the presidential vote with 73% of the vote, getting support across the Ukraine. Unlike the previous presidents, he got a lot of votes in the east and a lot of votes in the west as well. So Russia currently, for the last 20 years, it's a personalistic dictatorship. Never in the history of Russia incumbents lost elections, though about 25 years ago, opposition controlled the parliamentary majorities. Since 1999, there is a leader, Vladimir Putin. There are no competitive elections, so we actually do not know whether he would have won if there were elections. The media are tightly controlled, and by now political opposition is either jailed or pushed out of the country. In 2014, there was a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. In 1991, the dissolution of the Soviet Union was peaceful, and Crimea, which many in Russia consider a historical part of Russia, became a part of Ukraine, basically because in the Soviet Union, nobody cared about drawing the republic's borders because they were not supposed to ever become independent. Also, millions of Russian speakers who themselves think that they're Russians were left in the Ukrainian territory. So in 2014, there was a domestic conflict over EU accession in Ukraine. There was bloodshed in Kyiv, and the President Yanukovych, who was elected 3 years before that, was removed. So after that, Russia peacefully occupied Crimea and supported Russian-speaking separatists in the eastern Ukraine. So if you look at the map of Ukraine, this is Crimea. This is the size of these separatist-held territories. So there was a small war, and the separatists would have lost to the Ukrainian army and police, but Russia provided military support. Eventually, Russia sent troops and defended this enclave. So I wanted to say one thing about Russia peacefully occupying Ukraine, because it eventually played an important role in the President Putin decision to invade Ukraine. The thing is that, of course, Russia sent soldiers to Crimea, but an important element of the peaceful occupation was that the Ukrainian army in Crimea decided not to fight the Russian soldiers. Most of the Ukrainian soldiers and officers in Crimea actually defected to Russia and become the parts of Russian army, including the Ukrainian fleet. So when we say peaceful occupation, it's not a unilateral Russian action. It's also a reflection of a deep division in Crimea and within the Ukrainian army over what was happening. So before the conflict in 2022, this is basically the numbers of about the military capacity of Russia in Ukraine. So Russia, of course, a country that has one of the largest armies in the world. It's the second. It's ranked the second by military strength. But one thing that I wanted to emphasize, although Russia has a huge advantage in terms of the number of tanks, combat aircraft, helicopters, everything, Ukraine is also has one of the largest armies in the world. It's the second largest army in Europe. So it's not that it's a kind of negligible military force, even before February 2024. Okay. I wanted to speak very briefly about Russia's regions to invade Ukraine, because I think it has a huge bearing on what is to expect. So, of course, there was these historical tensions and grievances. Again, a typical European situation. Take two neighboring countries in Europe, and they will have these kind of grievances, this kind of minority, this kind of a language division. So there is nothing unusual here. But over the years, President Putin and his close circle, those to whom he speaks, they formed a very specific worldview, and this worldview included the assumption that Ukraine doesn't have any kind of a stable government, that President Zelensky is not someone who is chosen by Ukrainian people, but merely a puppet of local oligarchs of the United States, that there is no Ukrainian military which is capable of any kind of serious resistance. Remember the Crimea example? That's what they expected from the Ukrainian military in 2022, that there will be no resistance, that the Ukrainian military will simply defect toward Russia, that Russian troops will be greeted as liberators, basically because they think that there is no government in Ukraine. Then if there is a force that brings the government to Ukraine, then this will be welcomed. I talked many times not to President Putin, but to some people who advise him, and it's hard to believe what kind of picture of the United States and European Union they have. So they really believe that United States is on the brink of a civil war over domestic issues. The implication is that they will never pay attention to what is going on in the territory of the former Russian Empire, that European countries are too decadent and weak and corrupted by Russia, so they're too dependent on Russian gas and oil, so they would not provide any assistance to Ukraine. Okay, so on February 24, 2002, there was, the invasion started, tank columns marched into Ukraine, so this is the capital, again, the seventh largest city of Ukraine. It's very close to the border of Belarus, which is by now is occupied by Russia and is not an independent country. Simultaneously, the Russian troops attacked from Crimea and from the proper Russian territory and from the separatist-held enclave. So immediately, most countries in the world condemned the invasion. Most of the West, United States, Great Britain, European Union, individual European Union members, other countries started to provide significant military assistance. I need to say, for those who do not watch international conflicts closely, it's not always the case, to put it mildly, that the United States administration has a very clear understanding on what is going on. So actually, for those people who watch conflicts for a long time, the attention of the Biden administration and their competence in the assessment of what is going on was actually sort of a big and positive surprise. So then United States, Great Britain, other countries imposed significant sanctions. They imposed sanctions against Russian government bodies and their resources, against Russian government officials, including top leadership and their families, and on Russian business elite, including those who live abroad. So one big development since the start of the invasion is the failure of the initial Russian assault. So this assault failed completely. A huge amount of Russian armory and at a great loss of soldiers. Basically, this assault was defeated. Of course, there was a massive human toll of this, and the data here on the number of the Ukrainian civilians killed, including children killed, Ukrainians, refugees in neighboring countries, and people dismissed, these are underestimated. There will be perhaps more. So the human toll is massive. This was particularly painful to read about this girl because, up until the age of 21, when she was killed, her history is totally like mine. She was a student in a mathematical school, then joined the mathematics department. She taught math to kids in a high school. Then she volunteered to stay in Kharkiv and was killed by a Russian missile. And of course, when I wrote about her in my blog, I found out that she's obviously a friend of my kids' friends. So that's just a small world. Okay, So by March 2029, there was a stalemate. The initial assault in this and these directions was defeated. Here, the stalemate is like the Russian troops moved closer to the large Ukrainian cities, but were able to take only one city, Kherson. All other cities are either small or still being defended. So, and then, after the stalemate, the Russian troops withdrawn. That's when the atrocities of Bucha and Borodyanka became known, because Russia withdrew troops from here. So now what was happening on the occupied territories became known. So let me talk where it goes from here. So economics is as follows. Ukraine is expected to lose about half of its GDP in 2022. This means that life cannot be sustained without a massive humanitarian aid. The good thing is that this massive humanitarian aid is being provided both to the Ukrainian refugees in neighboring countries and to Ukraine. At the same time, once the war ends, it's possible that there will be a fast recovery and sustainable growth. So Ukraine will be in a similar position to Germany and Japan after the World War II. Both countries experienced very fast recovery and sustainable growth for decades after this fast recovery. But of course, and Ukraine will be actually in a much better position, because if the war ends with the Ukrainian government in place, then they will not be defeated in the way Germany and Japan were defeated in World War II. But of course, a Marshall Plan for Ukraine is critical. Okay, that's great that it's now sort of well understood, and already there are good blueprints for the Marshall Plan for Ukraine. Russia, on the other hand, is expected to have a 10% loss of GDP in 2022. This is a result of severe economic sanctions, but also the results of hundreds of international firms ceasing and pausing their Russia operations. They do this not because of sanctions, but because Russia and operating in Russia became toxic. Not all the international firms ceased these operations, but most, every important consumer brand already had. In addition, though not all the countries sanctioned Russia for the invasion, a lot of firms from countries that did not sanction Russia, like Chinese firms, including the largest firms, they are reluctant to conclude new contracts or reluctant to buy, for example, Russian oil, or require very steep discounts because they either they fear additional economic sanctions on them for their support of Russia, or just because they do not want to be associated. Then tens, if not hundreds of thousands fled Russia since February 24. So in the long term, this is a brain drain, which is compared to what happened 100 years ago after the first Russian Revolution, and what happened 30 years ago after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. If the war becomes if what is going on becomes even worse, then probably the European countries would introduce a gas embargo. In this case, this will be a huge loss of GDP. And of course, under any scenario, even under a scenario of a military win, the long-term prospects for Russia are dim. A country certainly cannot grow under such sanctions, and it's difficult to imagine a scenario under which the sanctions will be lifted without withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine. Okay, two things about, two words about information and information wars. So basically, since February 24, Russia introduced a de facto martial law. So as it always happens in Russia, it's not called a martial law, but the laws that are put in place, they're in fact martial law. So thousands are prosecuted or arrested or detained for protests. And even using the word war is criminalized. a lot of people were persecuted for posting something against the war on social media, or just going to a street or to a cafe with a sign saying that no war. A person was fined, so I mean, there is the name of this person for having this sign, just keeping the list with this sign, because it could be read as "Нет войны," no war, in Russia. And I need to say that when you discuss an issue of what to do with the Russian scholars, whether to look at the public statements or letters signed, you need to know that for those who stay in Russia, the laws are actually extremely severe and people get persecuted. So even saying that I'm against war is criminal. I'm not saying that everyone who said that they're against war is already persecuted, but some people are. So it's not even legal if a person asked to sign a statement that they support the war. I'm not sure that by now it might be illegal to say that you're against signing this statement. So just have this in mind. Of course, all independent media closed down, and Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter are blocked in Russia. So basically, I was spending my sabbatical year in Russia this year because I thought that I could somehow contribute to pushing, to trying to stop the train with my bare hands. But I've left in early March because basically every media for which I was writing a column or for which I could do podcasts, they were closed down. Facebook was blocked, and I'm writing a lot on Facebook in Russian, so it didn't make sense to stay. So there is the official narrative in which the war is a special operation which denazifies and demilitarizes Ukraine. It's illegal, it's criminalized to describe this operation in different terms. It's criminalized, it's illegal to talk about the evidence of atrocities. Even to talk about military casualties is illegal. And official statements in Russia, they're filled with nationalist, anti-Ukrainian rhetoric. So Western media, including best American media, they reported about big public support for war in Russia. I'm not sure. I think the evidence is mixed. On one hand, the sociological surveys show like 80% support for the war and for what President Putin does. At the same time, in some of this survey, including the survey which was widely publicized, answering no was actually a crime by the current laws. So it's a crime to say that you do not support the operation. So I'm not sure that this kind of a survey is indicative of anything. Thousands of people signed open letters against the war, including thousands of scholars. In my Moscow University High School of Economics, hundreds of people, hundreds of professors signed the anti-war statements, although they could be criminally prosecuted, and some people are getting prosecuted. I also expect everyone who signed this letter to be eventually fired. In Ukraine, since the beginning of the war, the government introduced many restrictions. They closed down the Russia-sponsored TV channel, but the independent media, including a lot of Russian language media, continue to operate, and all major world media, not only Western media, but Chinese media, Al Jazeera, they're operating everywhere on the ground. The Ukrainian government discloses a lot of information, so the government provides much more details on both Russian military losses and civilian deaths in Ukraine. And the information that is provided by the Ukrainian government squares very well with the media reports. So it seems that the Ukrainian government does use very successfully openness as I would say, informational warfare. President Zelensky addresses Ukrainians and Russians, both Russians in Ukraine and Russians in Russia, in Russian every day. President Zelensky was the most popular comic actor in Russia before becoming a politician and then a president. He meets with foreign officials. He spoke to Russian journalists from independent media. So the openness is totally unprecedented. And of course, as the war is waged on the Ukrainian soil, the world watches the massive human toil and witnesses war atrocities. At the same time, in Russian media, for the consumption of Russian people, all the massive human toll is attributed to the either work of Ukrainian forces, so they bomb their own cities, or just staging. They bring the dead bodies and put them on the streets and then invite Western journalists to report. So this is my last slide, because the pose currently is sort of military. It seems that Russia accumulates troops here and plans a huge assault on this part of the Ukraine. So after losing the Battle of Kiev, there will be the Battle of Donbass, and most depends on the strength of the Ukrainian forces there.
Thank you for that insightful and lots of filled with facts description of what's the situation. So I'm now pleased to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Siegfried Hecker of Stanford University. He will be joining us online. Sig Hecker is a professor emeritus in Stanford's Department of Management Science and Engineering. He was co-director of Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation from 2007 to 2012. From 86 to 97, Dr. Hecker served as the 5th director of Los Alamos National Laboratory. He's an internationally recognized expert in plutonium science, global threat reduction, and nuclear security. Dr. Hecker's current research interests include nuclear non-proliferation and arms control, nuclear weapons policy, nuclear security, the safe and secure expansion of nuclear energy, and plutonium science. At the end of the Cold War, he fostered cooperation with the Russian nuclear laboratories to secure and safeguard the vast stockpile of ex-Soviet fissile materials. Among his professional distinctions, Dr. Hecker is a member of the National Academy of Engineering, a foreign member of the Russian Academy of Sciences, fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, fellow of APS, fellow of the Minerals, Metallurgy, and Materials Society, fellow of the American Society for Metals, and honorary member of the American Ceramic Society. So I will turn the screen over to Freeman welcome, Dr. Hecker. Please, take it away.
Thank you very much, Frances. Thanks to APS to be able to share my thoughts with you. So let me make sure I get things started. And let's see if that works. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes.
Okay, I will proceed from there. So thank you very much. Of course, it's such a sad time to be here, as you've already pointed out and the previous speakers have shown. It turns out for me, there's actually also a tremendous personal reflection on all of this, because I was born in late 1943 of Austrian parents in Poland, which is now about 20 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, close to Lviv. But what I want to do today is take a different tack, and that is to talk about the nuclear dimensions of Putin's war in Ukraine. So I've lived in this nuclear world because somehow, after coming to the United States and going to Los Alamos I wound up as director of Los Alamos, and so I've lived in this nuclear world for the last 50 years or so. And so as I look at the ramifications of Putin's war, is what I find is that as Russia has gone from a responsible nuclear state to this reckless state that it's in right now, that Putin's war is destroying the global nuclear order. And I want to give you the essence of just how devastating that is right now and where we're heading. So let me sort of reflect on what I see as the nuclear world. And I'm going to take a diagram here that my colleague Vic Reese at the Department of Energy, when we were working together in the 1990s, fashioned. And that is to say that, look, since we're talking about a factor of millions, in other words, millions of electron volts instead of electron volts in energy release, that you must deal with nuclear right. On one hand, it can lead to peace and prosperity if you do things right. On the other hand, it can lead to war and disaster. And so what I'm going to do is to cover all of these things, and then particularly to make the point that international cooperation is imperative if we're going to get the best out of the nucleus and avoid the worst. And that was sort of an American view, but let me tell you, my Russian colleagues, who I work with very closely over the years, had a very similar view. And here I show myself with Lev Dmitryevich Ryabev, who was former first deputy minister of atomic energy and also a former director of their Los Alamos. And he said, we arrived in the nuclear century all in one boat. A movement by anyone will affect everyone. And he said, so we're doomed to cooperate. And I used that title for my book that I show here that was published in 2016, where I have about 100 American and Russian scientists describe the work that we did together at the end of the Cold War to have us avoid the greatest nuclear dangers because of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And so what I want to cover is sort of go reasonably quickly through these nuclear dimensions, and you can see them here on my slide, and then to try to make the point that Putin has fractured that global nuclear order in all of these areas. So, of course, the question that's very much on the table right now and on many people's minds is, will Putin use nuclear weapons in Ukraine? In other words, will the no-use norm, which has now held since 1945, prevail in Ukraine? And so let me sort of reflect on that. That norm, of course, came from Reagan and Gorbachev, and particularly their meeting, which I show here in Reykjavik. And they said a nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought. But it turns out, ironically, that same dictum was just reaffirmed by the leaders of the P5, that is Russia, the United States, China, the UK, and France. They not only said that, but they say we'll also affirm that nuclear weapons, for as long as they continue to exist, should serve defensive purposes, deter aggression and prevent war. Well, it turns out, with Putin having put his nuclear weapons on special mode of combat duty, that has violated all of these principles. And so, in the end, as we look at the potential of nuclear weapon use, we have to go look at Russian nuclear doctrine. And as you can see here, it essentially says that it's okay to use nuclear weapons in response to conventional aggression if the very existence of the state is put in question. And so that already puts up a red flag and says, look, we need to be concerned. But for me, what was even much greater concern is in my book, one of my counterparts from the Russian Los Alamos wrote a paper that's called Nuclear Weapons of Russia. And what he laid out is that post the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I copy here just his comments on tactical or non-strategic, as he calls them, nuclear weapons. And he says that nuclear weapons must transition from weapons of mass destruction and be geared towards military missions. They must target all of these different things. And then he even goes on to say that only nuclear, or the threat of nuclear, will reliably neutralize chemical weapons. Of course, I don't know of many countries having used chemical weapons, although we had that problem in Syria. And as I'll point out later, we have some concerns about Russia. But then he does say that, tactical nuclear weapons are not just battlefield nuclear weapons, they're sort of a systemic equivalent of strategic. And what he says, strategic give you global deterrence, and tactical weapons give you regional deterrence. And in other words, one can say it sort of give you, the ability to make sure that you can do what you need to do in the near abroad. And so as we look at that, I must confess that at this point, I still don't believe Putin will use nuclear weapons. But if you give that sort, what I just mentioned, if you give that to Vladimir Putin, it's not clear to me that he won't just see the nuclear weapons coming from conventional, a smooth transition to tactical nuclear weapons to strategic nuclear weapons. And of course, that's what we must all avoid. So as I try to look at, so deterrence, coercion, yes, indeed, that's what Putin has done with his nuclear saber rattling and the threat to Ukraine and to the West. And one can ask, well, has that nuclear coercion worked? Well, to some extent, you have to admit that yes, it's worked because it's kept the US and it's kept NATO out. Yet on the other hand, if you look at where Russia is today and the effective countermeasures that the West has taken, supplying, military equipment and munitions to Ukraine, and the sanctions and the fact that Russia has become a pariah country, what it has actually gotten Russia just isn't clear. So that's the issue of nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrent. Let me turn to the issue of nuclear nonproliferation and arms control. George has already pointed out the issue of the fact that Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal on its territory after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And so there's been a lot of talk and a lot of papers written on the issue. Should Ukraine have returned the Soviet nukes to Russia in 1994? And then I'll also take a look. What about the rest of the nonproliferation regime? Well, it turns out, again, George Komodo has already pointed out that, yes, the Ukrainians gave the nuclear weapons back. In return, in the Budapest Memorandum, they got these things, essentially a security assurance, the independence, the sovereignty, the fact that nuclear arms wouldn't be used against them, economic pressure wouldn't be used to influence internal politics and so forth. And so as it turns out, at least from what I look at, by the way, the photo that I show is my Stanford colleague, former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, actually planting sunflowers in Ukraine when Ukraine finally returned the nuclear weapons to Russia. And in the end, this question, should they have returned it? In my opinion, there's no question they should have returned it. They never had operational control of these weapons. They were nothing but a burden for them. But the real issue here is that as they returned them, what they got in return were these promises, and Russia has violated almost all of those promises. So let me also address the question, so what about the rest of sort of this non-proliferation world? What has the Russian invasion of Ukraine done? And here's my view, sorry for a rather busy picture of this, but in the end, what one really has is that there's a non-proliferation regime. It's centered around the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but involves many other things in order, and in fact, it has limited the number of states that have decided to build nuclear weapons themselves. So it includes everything from security, alliance, diplomacy, sanctions, and then all of these things like the IAEA, working together on material and weapons security, border and port security, export control, all of these things are crucial. And all of them require international cooperation. They particularly require leadership from the main nuclear countries. And it turns out Russia has been a very important and responsible part of this non-proliferation regime over the years. And now they have put all of that in danger. Just for example, on sanctions, in North Korea's case, the US has tried to sanction North Korea along the way to its nuclear weapons. If Russia and or China does not join that sanction regime, they're not going to be very effective. And then let me just address the last aspect of this, arms control. Well, arms control was already dying and has been dying for the last almost 20 years. And we're now stuck with just this new START treaty, Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which is to expire in 2026. And with the current state of the situation with Russia and Ukraine, I just don't see how we're going to be able to revive that. And the world's going to be a much more dangerous place. So we were already, in a difficult situation, and the invasion of Ukraine has made it that much worse. What about nuclear terrorism? As you well know, after 9/11, the US spent an enormous amount of time, money, effort in going into several countries in order to try to prevent terrorism. In this particular case, of course, terrorism from terrorists, from non-state actors, and focus on nuclear and chemical. So what does the invasion of Ukraine bring us? Well, it brings us concern about state-sponsored terrorism. And in other words, if Russia goes in that direction for nuclear or chemical terrorism, rather than some terrorists being able to get some small amounts of nuclear material or chemical weapons, you have a state such as Russia that has enormous expertise and also still significant stockpiles. And then unfortunately here, history isn't very encouraging, and that is Russia, quite certainly has already used both radiological and chemical. This is the case of Alexander Litvinenko, who was poisoned with polonium-210 back in 2006. And then here, two cases of chemical terrorism, of the use of Novichok to kill another former FSB member from Russia, Sergei Skripal, and then the poisoning of his political opponent, Putin's political opponent, Alexei Navalny. So this, again, it adds a new threat that if we have to worry about Russia, and of course you've heard there's several concerns about chemical weapons potentially being used in Ukraine, and so we now add that. What about nuclear power? What about nuclear plants in wartime? And here, sorry for all the words, but I think you get the general idea that the Russians shelled the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. And it turns out, fortunately, after the Fukushima accident, the US had helped Ukraine to harden its nuclear power plants, but it was against extreme external events, either terrorist attacks or natural hazards as such. And the problems and concerns, of course, are station blackout, loss of offsite power, et cetera, et cetera. And now we have the situation with Putin's war saying, how do we protect these nuclear power stations and structures from a military attack, not just from terrorist attack. And then the question is what happened at Zaporizhzhia is the personnel was intimidated by the Russians that moved in. And so how does one now go about looking and making sure that we can avoid problems in the future? And as most of you know, Putin's military also overran and occupied the Chernobyl nuclear site. That was nowhere near as dangerous as shelling an active nuclear power plant. And so, what do we do? Well, as I look at it, we need to now rethink nuclear power plants and how we harden them against foreign military excursions. What one needs to do is to negotiate agreements to leave the other countries' nuclear power plants off, from military attack. That was actually done by India and Pakistan in 1998. But it's, to my knowledge, no place else in the world. And then, the invasions and sanctions that are the sanctions that have actually been applied to Russia, that has made countries revisit whether nuclear power is actually a better way to go in the future in order to lessen the reliance on Russian fossil fuel. But what Putin has done, he's jeopardized Russia's global role in nuclear power plants and fuel cycle services. And you talk about shooting yourself in the foot. That was one of the big exports of Russia. They're the biggest supplier in the world. And is it going to be a responsible supplier? What about the Russian nuclear test facilities for nuclear power operations? They've been quite useful in the past. What about the contracts that it has for its light water reactors with these different countries? And then what about Russia and the IAEA? Russia actually has been a very strong and responsible member of the IAEA. And so to me, as I look at all of this, I come to the conclusion that the global nuclear power world has just been turned upside down by what Putin has done. So let me come to the final point, which is actually the most important point that I want to make, is because of the way the nuclear world has been turned upside down, that nuclear cooperation, which was important in the past, will be critically important in the future. And I'm just going to run you through very quickly. First of all, during Soviet times, as already been pointed out by George Kamota, there was cooperation. There was scientific cooperation between the Soviet Union and the US. For example, we at Los Alamos, we did a solar neutrino experiments with the Soviets down in the Baksan mountains, still doing Soviet times. But then when the Soviet Union came apart, the problems became much more severe, and this required cooperation at a whole different level. Here, senators, actually on the left is Senator Richard Lugar, on the right is Senator Sam Nunn, and they co-authored the legislation that was called the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. That's already been mentioned. And in essence, they did that because at that time we faced what I call the four loose nuke problems. And that is loose nukes, loose nuclear materials, experts, and then exports as well. And the cooperation between the nuclear scientists and engineers was absolutely essential. It brought me to the first visit of Russia. I should say that the first of 57 visits to Russia. This was in 1992, where I'm on the right and I'm greeting Yuli Hariton, the person we called the Russian Oppenheimer. And this began work in the DOE, the Department of Energy complex, and in many other areas of the United States of working on these nuclear problems together, not only with the scientists in Russia, but also those of the other forward swimming. We had a significant amount of work with Ukraine and really an enormous amount of work with Kazakhstan because it had the former nuclear test site. So these are the things we worked together. There was an enormous spirit of cooperation. Here's just one example. Here, my colleagues at Los Alamos in 1992 doing pulse power experiments behind the fence in the Russian Los Alamos. And likewise, the Russian scientists came and worked behind the fence at Los Alamos at the time. And we did scientific experiments together. These scientific experiments sort of build the relationship that we needed to tackle the really difficult problems in nuclear security. But indeed, these are all the problems that we worked on over times. And here's just an example that I've used in the past to indicate. So what were we after in the United States? As I showed you, it was a loop problem, but it was also curiosity. We wanted to know, how did these guys work? What were the Russians after? End of isolation, pay their people, etc. These are the things we need to think of as we now think about what is it going to be like when the war is ended. And what we really liked is sort of this common bond of scientists, engineers to discover, to create, and do science together. Of course, today with Russia, what it's doing, a lot of people have asked me, so was it worth doing all of this? And I say, well, look at the scale of the problem. You know, tens of thousands of nukes they had, more than 1 million kilograms of fissile materials, hundreds of thousands of people, the huge complex. And what happened? Well, no loose nukes. There was very little leakage of material, little to no nuclear brain drain, and some early problems, but much better in terms of export. And so 30 years later, there's no nuclear disaster. So why is that so? And again, I show this because we have to keep this in mind as we think about the Russian nuclear complex. They're nuclear workers, and in fact, the nuclear military. They were professional, patriotic, dedicated, responsible, and sort of in Dostoevsky's sense, willing to suffer to endure hardship, and they did. The US government stood tall and did some really important cooperative things, and the scientific community stepped in, and the human dimension was key. The nucleus part of the Russian complex is part of the civil society, and that remains in the complex today. So let me get to end up, again, give you the quote from Lev Ryabov, and what he said in 2015, as I was finishing up the book. He said, you know, we are doomed to cooperate. Our job is to convince our respective leadership that we must continue to work together. The only alternative, suspicion, returned an arms race, increased tension. He said, we must not go in that direction. And so I still believe that today, and with today's nuclear challenge, we'll be doomed if we don't cooperate. And so here is my 25-minute mark, and I'll wind up by just saying, you know, in this country, Putin's war has resulted in lots of anti-Russian sentiments and protests, you know, from the dumping of vodka, from banning of Dostoevsky, for example. But I say, don't shut out the Russian civil society. The science are a crucial part of that. International cooperation is essentially across the spectrum of physics and the rest of the sciences. And we need nuclear cooperation to make the world a better place. And we must keep the contacts as best as we can wherever possible. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Zig, for that informative talk and inspiring words at the end. So lastly, I'm happy to introduce the APS Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Jonathan Bagger. Dr. Bagger earned his bachelor's degree in physics and mathematics from Dartmouth, a master's degree from Cambridge, and his PhD from Princeton. After postdoctoral fellowships at SLAC and the IAS in Princeton, he joined the faculty at Harvard and then Johns Hopkins, where he was later appointed the Krieger Eisenhower Professor of Physics and Astronomy. At Johns Hopkins, Dr. Bagger served as department chair and as vice provost for graduate and postdoctoral programs. In 2014, he was appointed director of TRIUMPH, Canada's particle accelerator laboratory in Vancouver, and professor of physics and astronomy at the University of British Columbia. He moved back to the United States in 2021 to become the CEO of the American Physical Society. His research interests lie in particle physics at the interface between theory and experiment, and together with Julius West, he is the author of the monograph Supersymmetry and Supergravity. He is a fellow of APS and of the American Association of the Advancement of Science, and is a terrific partner to work with. Jonathan.
So I don't know how to make this full screen, but I guess that's okay. So thank you, and I will go rather quickly to try to leave some time for discussion. I really appreciate the talks from the first speakers, very important. Thank you. Frankly, and moving insights. And, my personal connection is that my two adopted daughters are Lithuanians, so my family's watching very closely as well. And also as a supersymmetry theorist, I have really friends and colleagues both in Russia and in Ukraine. So my job here is to talk a little bit about the American Physical Society's response to the crisis in Ukraine. And the best place to start is with the APS mission, because in times of crisis, go back to your mission, your vision, and your values. And so if you look, the APS is supposed to be advancing and diffusing the knowledge of physics for the benefit of humanity. And how do we do it? One way is by advancing scientific discovery and research dissemination, and the other is that we advocate for physics and advocate for physicists and amplify the voice for science. How do we do that? We do that by following our values. And so we have core values that came out of the 2019 strategic plan, including truth and integrity, partnering, cooperation, and open collaboration, and speaking out. That is the way we carry out our mission. Also, last year, the APS Council went through an elaborate procedure which involves consulting with the membership and many steps for issuing an APS statement. And the APS issued a statement on the international nature of science. And at the end, it says the APS will continue to take action in support of the human and professional rights of scientists in all countries, and encouraging scientists to take conscientious and responsible actions to protect those rights and to further international scientific cooperation. We didn't have this crisis in our minds when this was written, but it applies perfectly to today. So a few days after the invasion, APS issued a communication. This communication condemns the Russian invasion of Ukraine, mentions that APS is gravely concerned about its impact, that the society stands in solidarity with the Ukrainian physics community and all people whose safety has been jeopardized, whose homes, families, and careers were disrupted by the violence. And then the response seeks ways to serve its members in both Russia and Ukraine during this difficult time, Ukraine and Russia, and really underscores the principles from the statement that came out the fall before, but also, frankly, also re-emphasizing the rights and freedoms conveyed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A few days later, when Russia started shelling the nuclear plant, APS also issued a communication decrying that and emphasizing the dangers. So just before this meeting, the APS Board and Council met to discuss the response, the APS response to the war, and the Council passed a resolution which was endorsing some principles that were set forth by our Committee on International Scientific Affairs. Amy, as Director of International Affairs at APS, works closely with this committee. This committee is chaired by Alan Hurd from Los Alamos. It has members on it, such as Hillary Clinton's science advisor when she was at the State Department, people who've come from the Office of Science, Technology, Policy. They are our experts, our community experts. And in particular, they really proposed a framework for us thinking about our response to Ukraine. And in particular, our goals as APS are to support the affected physicists, to foster physicist-to-physicist engagement, and direct sanctions only towards institutions. And so what we'll be doing as we're considering the steps as crises evolve, this will keep going for a while clearly. Any sanctions that APS puts forth will be proposed by CISA, this committee, and approved by the board or its executive committee. And the board is in the process of crafting a formal board statement to codify this policy. This statement will go before CISA, before the Panel on Public Affairs, POPA, and the Council Steering Committee. And so again, will be setting us in place with a framework. Basically, though, this council's recommendation to preserve the physicist contacts is in line with historical precedent. For example, in 2002, APS issued a formal statement, one of the ones that goes before the membership, before many people, that was taking a stand against the call to boycott Israeli scientists. So in that statement, it says the APS reaffirms its commitment to maintaining an open dialogue, promoting cooperation among scientists throughout the world, and the APS strongly opposes attempts to isolate any scientific community. Likewise, going even back to 1980, if you have your Physics Today, somewhere on a shelf, you can find an editorial from Hermann Festbach entitled, "Let's Not Boycott Soviet Physicists." Now, clearly today the situation is ever changing, the legal constraints are changing, community perspectives are changing and varying, and so we certainly will be monitoring the situation continuously. There is a web page that's linked to the very top page of the APS website where you can find out what's going on. And also now there has been an engaged community set up where people can share resources and information on how to help the physicists. So these policies have been informed by outreach to Ukrainian science leaders in the United States. We've supported the effort at their request by writing letters to Ukrainian officials. We're also deeply connected to the Polish Physical Society because they're on the front lines, and they're feeding us intelligence all the time about what we could do, coordinating with our European partners and seeking perspectives as well, nationally and internationally, including listening sections at the March and April meetings, talking to the U.S. National Academies, the U.S. Department of State, and other science societies, including the AAAS. So, some of the other responses at a level down in detail is that our publications, we will continue to make decisions about manuscripts based entirely on their scientific merit. Again, in line with keeping scientist-to-scientist communications open. We are also providing complementary access to journals and help covering article publication charges for physicists who are affected by the conflict. We've also providing free membership to people who are affected by the conflict, and also have actually granted virtual access to this meeting to some physicists in Ukraine who've requested that. If you know somebody who needs help accessing our resources, have them contact us at help@aps.org. So just a couple more points. The highest priority right now is to support scholars in the region. The national academies in the U.S. are coordinating the U.S. response to that. Basically, the point is that many of the people in Ukraine don't want to leave the region. They have family next door. They have family in Ukraine. And so many people are expected to stay in the country to help with the resistance. So we're putting an appeal for short-term scholar visits to the region. Basically costs $6,000 to support somebody for 4 months in the region. So we're with the National Academy of Sciences, working with the Polish Academy of Sciences, seeking funding for those stipends. Information is on our website. Also, though, while the crisis is underway, waiting for people to return, we don't want to encourage a brain drain, but we also want to provide a home for people, even in this country. So if your institution is willing to host a scholar, contact the National Academies. They're coordinating it. Donate to the National Academy Safe Passage Fund. Contribute to or contact scholars at risk. If you're from a European institution, you can contact the Alliance of the European Academies. You can also make a personal donation. If your unit and APS wants to contribute to the National Academies, let us know. APS will match your unit's contribution, again, because what they really need is support for people, especially in the region right now. So in conclusion, let me just say again that APS is committed to the principles expressed in our statement on the international nature of science. We'll continue to take action in support of human and professional rights of scientists in all countries. These are our values. Thank you.
Thank you. This mic is active. Excellent. So we are now going to open up the floor for questions or comments from the audience. If you wish to ask a question, please, or make a comment, please do come up and use. I only see one microphone, so please do come up to the microphone up here near the front. Just form a line. I ask, as I said at the beginning, please do limit your comments or questions to a minute or less. We want to make sure to hear from people who wish to express themselves. So, and each person is limited to one question or one comment until everybody's had an opportunity to ask a question or comment. Okay, so with that, I believe we have a question from the online.
Sure, and we invite questions from the online community as well. And while you're making your way to the mic, here's a question from those watching virtually. Could you elaborate on what can neutrino physics contribute to nuclear non-proliferation in the current context?
Well, that sounds like a question for Sig. Sig, are you online? Can you handle that one?
I am. Thank you. So the most important part of neutrino physics collaboration is just to have scientists working with each other in the spirit of trying to best understand the world. However, there are a number of neutrino techniques that are being investigated and actually developed for monitoring and verification for things like arms control related treaties. So there are a number of universities and also the national laboratories that are working on that. And it's an important part. And so it's both science and it has nuclear related applications. Thank you.
Thank you. I see somebody at a microphone.
Hi.
Maybe introduce yourself briefly.
Sure. My name's Kenny. I'm a graduate student at UC Berkeley. Thank you to all the panelists for all of the remarks, and it was very informative, and I appreciate it. I want to begin just by saying that in no way, shape, or form do I want to try to compare various atrocities throughout the world, and I think violence is a horrible thing, obviously, throughout the world. But I have a question about, first of all, has APS come forward with any statements about other atrocities in the world, such as the genocide in Myanmar, for example, the violence in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or the atrocities committed by the American government in the form of the invasions of Iraq or Afghanistan? And if not, why?
Thank you. That comment has been expressed. I've heard that from various people, so a much appreciated comment. John, may I ask you to take that one?
Yeah, there are many, many tragedies in the world. We as a physics society focus on the ones that are closest to physics, I think. We can't comment on them all. They are all heartbreaking, terrible tragedies. This one in particular is very close to physics for the reasons that we heard in the historical talks. So I think it's a little closer to our core. But the other issue is that we're being effectively asked to comment by the government. For example, in Afghanistan, the government did not want us to be working with them. Here the Ukrainian government is wanting us to help, and so we can help more.
Thank you.
Okay, I think I didn't notice the order, so I'm just going to alternate microphones. So the back microphone next.
Thank you. Yes. Alec Linden from University of Mainz. I was curious on the technical side, stepping back for a moment, there's a comment that came to mind from Arthur C. Clarke that it's possible to design a system that is proof against failure, but that it is not possible to design a system that is proof against deliberate malice. And so I was curious from that design perspective, both from a technical level with things like pebble bed reactors and fusion systems that are more intrinsically safe but still leverage nuclear power, but also on the design of international systems and norms, whether the panelists, and perhaps in particular Dr. Hecker, believe it's possible to design a system that remains safe indefinitely, or if we're fundamentally bound to always fall back into these kind of conflicts? Thank you.
That sounds like a perfect question for Sig. Sig, can you handle that one?
Well, thank you. That's a very tough one. I think the bottom line answer is no. That we just can't design something that is going to withstand anything possible. However, for example, if we get to the nuclear power world, yes, there are definitely things that one can do that will limit the potential damage. And so reactors today can be built much, much safer than in the past. And particularly, we know how to design a reactor against the loss of coolant accident. We also find that if we go to the smaller reactors, from a safety standpoint, everything becomes better. And so, yes, there are things that can be done, but I view this current invasion as being an important step in the nuclear power arena as we go from the three big accidents of 3 Mile Island in the US, Chernobyl in the Soviet Union, and of course in the Ukraine actually, and then Fukushima. In each case, we learned a lot, and the world has taken new and different approaches, and the invasion of Ukraine and the incursion into an operating nuclear power plant now will have to make us take another whole look. And so what I would say, your question is very, very good. We need to now take that much more seriously and make sure we can do better in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I think front microphone now.
Hi. Thank you so much for organizing this. This is Glennis Farrar at NYU. I have a question, actually two, for I think Professor Sonin probably. One, it's a factual one. If a Russian scientist wanted to just leave with their family and had the means to do that, would they be able to, or are the restrictions that are being imposed at this point sufficient that that would be not possible? The second question is, in the conversation that we hear about the trade-offs for Europe, especially Germany, about importing gas and why it's difficult to get, quit doing that and embargo Russian gas, people always talk about how it's hard on their economy. But reading about the global impact of food shortage and so on, it seems like overall that could be much worse than on their economy. And I wonder if you ever hear that discussion going on, and if not, if it should be injected. Thank you.
Thank you. That sounds like a question for Konstantin.
Okay, on the first question about whether a Russian physicist would be able to live. So first, up until very recently, up until like the first days of April, the Russian government tried to sort of push out everyone who politically opposed. So if a person said something, got in trouble because saying something anti-war or anti-Putin, then the typical approach is to push a person out of the country rather than to keep people in the country. At the same time, it seems that the government gets gradually concerned about the outflow of IT specialists and finance specialists. So these people get interviewed on the border, and sometimes these interviews take hours. Still, there has been no single report about a person who would be denied the possibility to leave the country because she or he works in finance or IT. And I would expect physicists to be included in this category as well. But I would say my natural assumption as a political economist, as a student to some extent of the Soviet Union and Russia, that there will be more and more restrictions on the possibility to leave. So but they're not there yet. But it should not be discounted the possibility that there will be restrictions similar to the Soviet Union restrictions, and we know that in Soviet Union sometimes the restrictions were extremely severe. On gas embargo, I mean, gas embargo is not introduced because for European countries this will mean a recession and perhaps losing a couple of percentages of their GDP. So they do not want to risk crisis. Of course, there is a possibility of a food crisis because Russia and Ukraine are huge exporters, exporters of grain, but this is even like, I mean, the Ukrainian well-being is the secondary concern for European countries, and the third world problems is the third-rate concern. So this is a possibility, but nobody is going to care about this.
Okay, the gentleman at the second microphone first.
Yes, hi, Chad Henshaw from Georgia Tech. We've talked a lot about nuclear weapons. I was just curious, what do you think the role is of scientists in the development of other advanced weaponry being used now, like hypersonic weapons and advanced weaponry that we might get into the future? You know, what kind of responsibility should we take when we're working on these sort of breakthroughs?
Well, Sig, I think that is, again, I'm going to call on you if you have some insight into that, perhaps.
Yeah, that's very good question. Of course, the role of the scientists, of people, let's say, at Los Alamos, like myself over the years, I worked on the nuclear weapons program, and I did it to a large extent when I came there as a summer student. The director, Norris Badbury, said at an introduction, he said, at Los Alamos, we don't develop nuclear weapons to kill people. We develop nuclear weapons to buy time for leaders of the world to come to their senses and make the world a better place. So that's the sense of essentially the way that I viewed my role at Los Alamos as far as nuclear weapons. And early on, it was the modernization and improvement of nuclear weapons. And so you're in the defense business. You're in the business of trying to make sure that you keep up or you stay ahead of your potential adversaries. So I think that's what scientists and engineers are doing in the United States now. We, of course, pay great attention to the political world. And in 1992, President George H.W. Bush, this was as director at Los Alamos, said, we will not build nuclear weapons with new capabilities. Well, it turns out that stayed that way until just the last year or two. Whereas the Russians, after 2000 or so, started to develop the new capabilities and then blend, as you mentioned, hypersonics, for instance, blend hypersonics with nuclear warheads. And so it's a combination of the technical developments and the political developments. And that's the way we do it in the United States. And from what I see in the Russian nuclear complex, it's very similar. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take one of the questions from online. The question has been raised of concerning the historical event of NATO expansion after the end of the Cold War, which is a major source of feelings of fear and injustice in Russia that feed strong Russian revanchism. Does APS have a position on the issue of NATO expansion in the past or future? So I think I will, whether APS has an official position, I think nonetheless I'm going to turn to Konstantin to comment on that historical perspective and the question of Russian sentiment as a result of that.
That's totally true that in Russia there is a huge sentiment about NATO expansion, and in fact it's used as a justification of attacking Ukraine. I see a sort of logical inconsistency here, because if you're concerned about a NATO threat, then you probably need to attack NATO, not a neighboring country. The fact is that NATO countries has never attacked Russia, and those countries that were allowed to enter NATO, they are protected from Russia. I personally think that in 2014 it was the allocation of additional American and British troops to Baltics that saved Baltic countries from invasion in 2014. Of course, the number of soldiers were small. They basically allocated 500 soldiers to each of the Baltic countries, but this guaranteed that there will be dead Americans and British soldiers in the first hours of invasion. So it was sort of a commitment to protect these countries from invasion. So I think if Ukraine were a NATO country, then it wouldn't have been invaded, and all these kids and women in Ukraine would not have been killed. So I know that in Russia there is a huge concern about this, but still there is no single Russian ever killed by a NATO soldier.
Thank you. I'm going to take the the first person at the back microphone.
Mary Bishai from U.S. National Lab. I don't think I'm allowed to say which, but okay. I have a question about the response to the current response in terms of actions against institutions. Is the APS limiting its response to specifically this conflict, or is this crisis going to be an opportunity for the APS to clarify the principles by which we engage with institutions in countries that do not respect APS principles for the open, for either the humanitarian principles or principles of open scientific research and scientist-to-scientist cooperation?
Thank you for that question. John, I'm going to ask you to handle that one.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. The APS statements are reviewed every 5 years, and they go through a very rigorous review process. It happens to be the year that the statement on the against boycotting Israeli scientists is up for renewal. And so that statement's being looked at by POPA and will be looked at by POPA, and this is very closely connected to that. I'm sure they'll be also thinking about things in this direction as well.
Which will be an opportunity for membership to comment as well, as that's an integral process of the reviewing the POPA statement. Okay, the front microphone, please.
Thank you all for the informative discussion. Julieta Gruska, UNC Chapel Hill. My question was also about the APS response. I think I agree with the guidance of finding ways to sanction institutions without sanctioning individuals, but I think many international collaborations have struggled with ways to do this on a practical level. So I'm wondering if you can provide additional examples or guidance, specifically, especially when we're working with other countries that have their own guidance that might be stricter or looser than ours in the US.
Thank you for that question. I'm going to turn that over to John also.
Right, so CISA is meeting tomorrow morning, for example, to discuss the question of journal authorship, which I know is one that's come up. Paper authorship for journals as to how Russians should be identified in those papers. We are suspending our formal institutional contacts at this point. I mean, we're not instituting any new ones. So, for example, 2025 was supposed to be the International Year of Quantum Science and Technology. Russia was going to play a big role in helping us get that through the United Nations and UNESCO, and now we will not be working with Russia for that. So it really is a case-by-case basis. We really are relying on our CISA committee, the Committee on International Scientific Affairs, which has people who understand the implications of all of our actions. Some of these implications are a little indirect, and so it requires careful thought that they will provide.
We're going to get kicked out of here, unfortunately, shortly. So I think I lost track of who was in what order, so I'm just going to alternate. Back microphone next.
Hi, I have a very closely related question to the last one. My name is Eric Matt. I'm from the Colorado School of Mines. While writing a white paper for the snowmass process, our large international author list has run aground of several sanctions. And as a result of trying to account for this, we've been asked by our Russian colleagues to omit all of their materials and names and institutions from our white paper. This is, of course, unwanted, as we would like to support the scientists while not supporting the institutions, but because we had no clear guidelines or guidance from either the journals that we would submit to or the APS in general, this situation looked kind of inevitable. Is there a plan for clear guidelines and guidance to be released by the APS and its journals with regard to this sort of situation, specifically for things like keeping authors but omitting affiliations, and when do you expect those will be released?
So, yes, I believe that will come out of the CISA discussions, yes.
Okay, I'm being, you can see the Freeman people getting increasingly agitated, so I'm terribly sorry, but I'm going to have to cut off the questions. There's one online and 3 more people here. What I would suggest, please, submit questions you still have to international@aps.org, and we will endeavor to make sure that your questions are answered, okay? So sorry to those last few people who wanted to ask questions.